Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, developing innovative technologies for dealing with wildfires. Well, I say wildfires, but in many parts of the world, they're called bushfires. And today I'll be speaking with Ben Twomey, who is one of those people who calls them bushfires, and because he's in Brisbane. And Ben has done just about every aspect of wildfire conception, attack, planning, mitigation, like been in the space for a long time, let's just say. Ben, welcome to the Fire Break. How are you today?
Yeah, great, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Ben, tell us about Ben. How did you end up in fire? Uh,
Oh,
I know you've been there
unexpectedly.
since for a while, right?
Yeah, so not a huge amount of time. So I've watched a lot of your other podcasts with a lot of interest, and I'm not one of these 30-year veterans. I've been in the space for about 12 years as a volunteer firefighter, so relatively recently. And I've had, because we were talking about this just before, I've had a bit of a checkered background. So I started life as a military intelligence officer in the Army, and saw a bit of overseas service, and then I spent a decade at the Boeing company working in decision support and using simulation for decision support, particularly solving sort of complex quantitative problems there. And that's when I got into the decision science thing. So I studied operations research and statistics, and got into that. And then quite unexpectedly got a knock on my door. I live up in the mountains north of Brisbane, as you said, and in the bush, and I got a knock on the door from our local rural fire service, and asked me to join. So I did, and that completely changed my life. So I went from being a decision science type, building simulations to solve complex problems for business, and discovered this thing called fire management and firefighting, and I loved it. So from there, I was really quite lucky. So I got discovered, if you like, by the commissioner here in Queensland, the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services Commissioner at the time, by accident. Asked what I did. I told him. He got all excited. He said, "We've got a bunch of firefighters who are trying to do simulation." And he said, "It sounds like you're a simulation guy who's doing a bit of firefighting." I said, "Yeah, that's it." So he said, "Why don't you come and join us?" And so I did. And I was in Queensland Fire and Emergency for about 6 years, I guess. Became a fire behaviour analyst. Now one of about 50 or so in the country at level 3 certified. Took some turns leading the fire behaviour analysis team from Brisbane in the Black Summer, really nasty fire season we had down here in 2019. Deployed a bunch over the years to down into Victoria and Tasmania and the ACT, into level 3 incident control centres, providing support and fire behaviour analysis services, and built the Queensland Fire Services predictive analytics suite for bushfire, looking at the future and how we quantify bushfire risk into the future, and fire spread, and leveraging fire science into decision support. So that's the 20,000 foot view. So I've
That's a
got a
pretty good view, right?
yeah. So I've done a bit
And
around the
what
place.
an unusual way to be recruited and knock on the door.
Yeah, pretty much. It was
Right.
strange, but
That's
it's been
great.
great.
So that's the two aspects of fire dynamics that you do analysis on is one, the fire has started, what's going to happen next? And
Yep.
two, there's not a fire, when's it going to happen and where?
Yeah, not necessarily when's it going to happen, but given that it
Or
did,
when are
and
conditions
under sort of
favorable?
knowable conditions, what could we kind of expect? And the other thing, part of that is to sort of say, well, given the upper end weather regime, because synoptically speaking, so big picture speaking, when we see extreme fire weather or severe fire weather, the synoptic setup is usually fairly similar. So the wind directions come from roughly the same direction, and the peak conditions are roughly the same, and so you can infer a lot about what the fire risk looks like in a fairly decent way. And so that's what it's more about. So sort of figuring out, given that we see that, where is it and what should we do about it?
So the output is here's where this fire is going to go and when. Maybe
Yeah.
something to do, right? It's going to be at Brisbane at 1400, and it's going to be at whatever the next town is at 1500, etc. Right? So for kind of modeling out well, what values are at risk when
Yeah, I
is
think
part
for
of, and then
operational
topography.
supporting
So what
wildfires,
are all
that's
the
what we do.
inputs that what are the inputs that you drive into that?
Yeah, so the typical fire behavior triangle, right? So you've got three things that drive the fire behavior triangle, as opposed to the combustion triangle. Everybody thinks of that one, which is, the fuel, heat, and oxygen. The fire behavior triangle is actually fuel, weather, and topography. And so, you characterize each of those things in as much detail and with as much fidelity into the real landscape as you can. And you can use fire science to kind of infer, reasonable estimates of when and where fire is going to be and what's it going to be like.
Okay. So they recruit you, they take advantage of your background.
Yeah,
You bring a fresh perspective to it because you haven't been raised in the bushfire
yeah,
industrial complex, right?
that's right.
With whatever blinders that includes,
Yeah,
uh, or
you characterize it really well. Like there's you see a couple of fellas on the internet talking about perception versus perspective, and being an ex-intelligence officer, I really value that sort of view. I've been a person who tries to collect different lenses through which to look at problems. And one of the things that strikes me in the fire world is it's got a really unique culture, and it's whether it's in Australia or the US or Canada or all the places I've been, very response focused, very much action, quick, rapid response, focus on suppression, and yeah, my perception and the lenses that I look at this problem through are probably quite different from that. And I think in the broader sense of the wildfire problem that we face now, the megafire problem, I'm not sure that the community is looking at it through the right lenses. And I'm seeing a bit of a shift, which is great. But I think we've got a fair way to go.
so more heavily weighted value on new perspectives would be beneficial.
Yeah, okay. So
I mean, you have a problem and you say, go out and get me someone who knows a lot about this, and go out and get me someone who knows nothing about this, because we need both of their points of view.
yeah, look, I'm not sure. You characterize it as getting someone who knows nothing about it. I think it's more that what we do know inside the tent, the fire management people and the way fire management people have grown up, we've sort of extended the urban fire focus of suppress everything into the wildland space. And the evidence, it seems to me, doesn't support that approach. It doesn't seem like that's a terribly winning strategy. And I think that that's clearly evidence that we're spending more and more money than ever trying to chase fires that are getting bigger and bigger. And it seems to me that's just not working. And so I think we have to have a fairly big cultural shift. And yeah, so the lenses I think that I want to look through at this problem are the historical lens. I've done, and I certainly don't want to claim to be an expert in this, but I've done a lot of reading about fire history and the way fires evolved with people, and we're the only fire species on the planet, right? And I think we've lost sight of the fact that for many, many generations, fire has been our leading technology. It's been the thing that's transformed the planet. It itself is a technology. We have lots of people who are trying to focus on throwing tech solutions at the megafire problem, and we've forgotten that applied fire itself is probably the most powerful and useful tool that we've ever had, and it's shaped the planet. And we've forgotten that, and it's no longer really a part of our thinking. We reach for the AI or the drone or the bit of kit or the again, response focused. And you think, well, for millennia, our Indigenous people managed the landscapes much differently with fire. They didn't have chainsaws and Pulaskis and aircraft, and they did pretty well. It took them a long time to figure out how to manage the biota in a way that was safe and productive and sustainable. And I don't think that we really have that back yet. And I think that that's the most exciting thing for me that's emerging now, is we're starting to rediscover the need for that. And to me, that's where the most important questions lie in the wildfire space now, which is how do we kind of get back to that sustainable applied fire regime so that we properly manage the landscapes the way that they were,
Yes.
in the sense of the modern complex world that we live in, because that's what's the difficult bit. It's people. These aren't fire science problems. We know that this works. We've got plenty of evidence. These are cultural problems, legal problems, political problems that we're trying to surmount, not technology problems or fire application problems. We know how to do that.
So the issue isn't whether we know how to put out a fire or not. We do. The question is whether we should or not, and when.
Well, that's well
Right? Because
characterized.
there's nothing as effective at fuel reduction as a fire.
Yeah, so I think you hit it on the head. We not only do we know how to put out fires very well, particularly in North America, I think you suppress like 97% of them. Like you're more than good at it. You're brilliant at it. But we don't sort of realise that every time we put out a fire in the wilderness, that's a problem put off.
Yes.
It's not a problem solved. We're just adding more fuel downstream to when that 3% of fires that we don't get. Now it's got more to chew on, and that's going to cause us an issue. So, you talk about lenses and perspectives, and I think, when I sort of put my, network theory and decision science hat on, to me, we're going to have to change the way we plan and execute on wildfires to divert some of that money. Because like one of the things I think that strikes me really clearly is that most of the money goes to response, right?
Oh,
So
absolutely.
Like 95%.
So is that a cultural thing in Australia, the way it is here?
Oh yeah. And it's
right.
it's
No money for prevention, but endless money for response.
I wouldn't say endless, but it's there's a lot. Things materialize when you need them, right? When things are bad, and I think we're going to have to sort of start thinking about prevention and how we move that money more towards prevention, but in some novel ways that people probably haven't thought of yet. Like one of the things I do, and I've been trained to do, and I haven't done it yet operationally, but I'm looking forward to trying. I'm a planning officer, a level 2 planning officer. And so the way we think about suppression planning, given that's where the money is and we're there to suppress fire, I think that's going to have to change. I think we're going to have to start, rather than chasing fires and trying to put them out, which is, honestly, if we think about these big megafires, they're immune to suppression most of the time. And so why don't we start diverting those plans and that money in response to shoring up the landscape for future applied fire? So there's money for response. Let's spend it on suppression and going defensive when we need to. But let's set the landscape up strategically with that money so that in 2, 3, 4 years' time, we can fly an aircraft over it and light it up safely and effectively and start restoring good fire regimes back in. So in other words, when we see these giant megafires, we hold the ground. So, it's going to clear out the fuel for us, but let's figure out how to hold it in the future and let's start diverting some of that response money into that. I think that's something that might be considered. I don't know whether that's going to be well accepted, but I think these are the sorts of things we need to start thinking about.
They are, and I think that we need possibly a different political structure to support that.
Yeah.
Because if you're the senator or whatever who brought in all the aviation equipment and put out the big fire, you're the hero. If you're the one who diverted tax money towards cleaning up an overgrown forest, like that's not so sexy.
That's true, but I also think that you can have a foot in both camps here.
Yes, you could.
If we take the track of, we're trying to solve the wildfire problem through, creation of things that are going to help us to do preventative fire management downstream after the wildfire's out. You still get to fly your aircraft around. You still get to show you firefighters defending homes. So fundamentally, you're still doing a lot of the same things. It's just every time we see a new wildfire, hopefully we're going to hold that ground a little more, and the burden on actually experiencing those wildfires goes down through time.
So you must find yourself at odds with yourself sometimes, because on your analytical side, you may know how to put out bushfire more efficiently than many of your comrades who have been doing it, the same way since 6,000 years ago. And you're coming in, and it's like, oh, there's a new way to do this. And then the other side of you has to come in and say, but maybe we shouldn't. And it's, it's kind of like with cloning or something, right? Like, hey, we can do this, but should we?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. I'm fairly well able to separate response operations from, the fire management stuff.
So,
There's always a case for suppression. Like there's
sure.
I'm not sitting here saying that, oh, no, let's not do suppression. um,
Right. No,
you know,
but there are times where we shouldn't. There are times when we shouldn't because we're building up a fuel debt in an area where we don't have values at risk.
yes, I think that's true. And one of the things that I think bothers me the most is that that's a choice. And people, I don't think the
Right.
general public realise this, that inaction is actually a choice. And,
Yes.
by always doing suppression, it's really easily defendable. Oh, yeah, we're putting fires out because that's what we do in the cities, right? There's no
Right.
circumstance in a built environment where letting a low intensity fire burn through your building is going to make it better.
No.
And that's the environment that the suppression communities come from. We've extended this to the wildland, and the public has this impression that all fire is bad. I very much see it more like a vitamin.
Okay.
you
Yeah.
know, you got to get the dose right and the regime
Yeah.
right. So if you're taking that supplement in the right sort of intervals, in the right concentrations through time, you end up on balance much healthier and better. It's better for everybody. But
That's a great
if I give
analogy.
you, 5 kilograms of vitamin A to take today, you're not going to be feeling too well by tonight. It's like a megafire, right? And so we have to get this education of the public. We've lost the fire culture in the broader public, is what I think. We've become disconnected from the thing that really defines human beings. We're the fire species. There's no other species on the planet that uses it, and I think
Yeah, and
we've
that's
become
probably a good
disconnected from
thing,
that.
right? We've managed it poorly enough on our own without other species getting in the mix. Um,
Yeah,
so let's go back to what you were talking about, indigenous burning,
yeah,
right? A good thing when done with sufficient knowledge.
that's right.
And what I worry about is, and you can tell me if there's evidence for this or not, but I worry that we oversimplify what has taken thousands of years to do very precisely. We take the idea like, oh, there's good fire. Great. Let's go burn a bunch of stuff up. Not realizing that there's a season for each species that you're burning and a flame heights that you're trying to maintain. And, that this is something that can be done all year round if you're species sensitive. And how do we extract the subtleties of the indigenous science of prescribed fire?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. This is again one of those really fortunate things for me. I was able to go and do what they call the Jigger Jar Indigenous burning program up in Hell's Gate in far north Queensland, which was an amazing, profoundly changed the way I think about fire. Um, and you're right, that's part of the question. It's a big part of the question, which is how do we unlock the wisdom and the tools of the Indigenous communities for contemporary fire management people today to actually apply this fire in a way that's safe and beneficial. And it's a long answer. We could talk about this for a lot of time. But one of the things I think from learning up there and what I've read, you talk about subtlety and lots of detailed knowledge, and there is indeed a lot of that. Amazing stories get passed down generationally, and there's ceremonies and a whole bunch of cultural underpinning that helps the Indigenous people maintain that knowledge and cultural connection with the land, which is wonderful. But of course, we Westerners don't really have that, and we've
Right.
lost a
We
lot.
don't want to know about the culture and the sitting around the fire talking about it.
Yeah,
We want to know, okay, what are the actual practical tips? And I'm not, yeah, I'm speaking as a culture, not for myself,
no,
but
no,
we
you're
want to,
absolutely right. And so
right.
part of what I've this is where I'm really fortunate to work with AEM at the moment, and part of the things that I realised being inside the fire agency is that to unlock the fire science that can sit beneath this Indigenous knowledge and provide practical tools that are going to guide people as to when burning windows open in the right sort of vegetation types and when they can burn safely and how to burn safely. That's my latest focus in AEM, is building a tool suite that helps look forwards, characterize the fuels differently rather than sort of a national fuel map every 12 to 18 months.
Right. There's things that are vegetation and things that aren't. No,
yeah. So
a little more to it than that. Right.
Yeah. So I'm building a scalable fuel mapping schema that updates every 5 to 12 days.
Wow.
So that we can start to track the difference between drought stress fuels and non-drought stress fuels, and the way the canopy cover changes and changes the wind penetration through the fuel complex and these sorts of things. So it all sits on top of good data. It has to. But to get back to your question, once you have that data in place, we've got a sufficient. So fire science is always a bit rubbery. There's fairly big error bars in it, which is okay, right? I don't think we need to chase perfection here. It's good enough to give a quantitative underpinning for the people who don't really understand how to read the country and when to apply fire. So there's a huge amount that could be done in terms of applying data and technology to unlock people's ability to apply fire in the proper regime or in a more appropriate regime. But I think one of the things is, so I think we can solve that. I think technology and data has come far enough, and satellite and remote sensed imagery. We've got enough information at our fingertips now to be able to provide better tools, which is what I'm working on. I think the harder problem, Steve, is it's the culture and public education problem. How do we convince the public that we don't have a no fire option? That we can't just choose to not have fire. Right? We've tried that for 150 years. It doesn't work.
Any more than we can choose not to have disease. I mean,
exactly right. Exactly right. So the question becomes, okay, so how do we restore, how do we convince people that, not only do we not have a no fire option, that we can have a beneficial fire option that will universally be better off. We can't just choose to have no smoke. There's going to be smoke. We have to do that. If we want a healthy vegetation and healthy biota, we've got to apply fire because it's a fire adapted biota. So that's the more, I think, harder nut to crack, is how do we actually get the public engaged and actually, bring them with us to say, we know this works. It's worked for 50,000 years here in Australia. And there's, everything is fire adapted. We have to restore the country to the way it was. And it's counterintuitive, right? Because people see these megafires and they don't think that the only way out of it really is to burn our way out. That's a hard message to sell.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's true. It's really the only one that's going to work.
Yeah, and we think about fires that occur in a vegetation environment very differently than the fires that we use ubiquitously in the petrochemical sense.
Oh yeah.
I cook on a gas stove. My car runs on fire. Right.
That's right.
We extracted fuels from the ground. We refine them, and then we do little controlled explosions inside this engine, which releases heat, which releases chemicals. All the same things a wildfire does, except we identify one like, oh my gosh, that's destructive and horrible, and this one like, well, I got to get to work. I mean,
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I don't think people have realised that we've actually got more combustion happening now than what we used to, in the ancient world, but less free burning fire. So like you say, it's all captured inside engines and other things. And I don't think there's any bit of modern technology that's not dependent on fire. The way we generate our energy, the way we create metals, all of it is fire dependent. But it's now industrial fire. It's not free burning fire. It's not, anthropogenic fire, as they call it. We're not managing landscapes anymore. We've sort of forgotten about that. And it's a problem. I mean, if we could see the amount of outputs from all our engines and everything else the same way we do from wildfire, it would change people's minds like that. Like, it'd be really quick. We just can't see it, but it's damaging, and it's a problem.
In some sense, it's a visualization problem. We looked at Canada last year and we said, wow, 7 billion tons of CO2 released by the fires. Like, Well, maybe that's how much are get released by cars every day, but
Yeah,
right,
but I don't think what people don't get though is that those vegetation systems regrow, and there's a
that's
fair
right.
amount of carbon that gets recaptured in that. So we talk about the total release, but I don't think we talk about the net release. And over time, those trees will regrow, they'll recapture that carbon. The
Yes.
soil will eventually start storing it again. It's less efficient with high intensity wildfires than it is with good fire. You can actually go carbon negative with a good good prescribed fire through time. Um,
Right.
but it's a much different prospect to burning lithic fuels that you dig out of the ground that, they had their sun shining on them millions of years ago. And now we're putting it into the atmosphere and there's nowhere to put it. So the
Right.
vegetation's not really taking that up. And it's not the same. And so we end up net positive with these nasty gases that are causing all the problems of the planet.
When we say you said there's nowhere to put it, and that makes me think about space exploration. And well, now we're going to go to Mars. Well, boy, if I ran Mars, I'd say, can I get references from your previous landlord?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good
Right?
point.
You didn't treat your own planet so well. Now you want to come and spread your chaos to others.
Yeah, that's
But it,
it. And I think if
yeah,
you know if we've got the wherewithal to get to Mars, colonize it, turn it into a civilization, surely we've got the wherewithal to fix this place first. Like we know how to do it.
right.
We've only ruined it in the last sort of 500 years. I think we can, you know,
Yeah, so you're
let's try to
hopeful for
fix it.
that. Yeah. So, but in order to do that, people have to think differently, and to think differently, they have to be educated differently or exposed to new truths.
Exactly right. Yeah, yeah. And
So, what are
like I
you
said,
doing about that, Ben?
what am I doing about that?
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to solve the education part of it, but I don't know that I'm the one for that. I'm not the best spoken
I
person,
think you are
and
actually. I don't know.
I'm a numbers sort of quantitative guy.
Okay.
I'm not great at communication.
I
So
beg to differ.
it's kind of you to say, but I don't feel like I am. It's going to take much more engaging, eloquent people than me with a bigger platform to try to bring the public along. But I think one of the things that has always worked with me is just compelling, simple messages. Trying to get across to the public that we don't have a no fire option. You don't get to
Right.
choose that we're just going to let nature be. And the reason for that is that we've spent 50,000 years of putting fire into that landscape, and it's changed to depend on it. It's as important to that landscape as sunlight or rain, and we've taken it out for the last 150, 200 years, and it's not going well.
No.
So just having people understand that is really a start. And I don't think we're there yet. I really don't, because I think if people did, then the people they elect, it's more important to them, and then things
Right.
start to change. And but I do think the pendulum is starting to move. And as we see, things like the cost of fighting wildfire going up at the same rate as the size of the fires, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at these things. They're immune to that. Once fires get that big and nasty, the only thing that's putting them out is rain.
Right.
We can go defensive and we can save properties, and it's dangerous work, and yep, we're all signing up to do it. But you're not going to keep up. We have to do something different.
Yeah. Right. Let me ask you to differentiate when you do fire behavior analysis. You're really using your computer science skill set. Um, when you do bushfire decision support, how does that hat look different?
So actually, I'd argue they're the same thing. So
You
being a
don't think
being a
they're the same thing. They're not the same
yeah, so
thing,
being a
right?
fire behavior analyst is all about me helping operational decision makers with their suppression planning and what to do next. So,
I
in
see.
other words,
Okay.
giving them a clearer picture of what we believe the fire could do given certain conditions, and the forecast is reasonably accurate, and we know
Right.
enough about the fuels to try to give them insights that they won't have from their own experience. And it becomes really important during like in Canada last season, where you're starting to see, and we're seeing it all the time in the media, record conditions, record breaking conditions. We've never seen these conditions before. So suddenly, a grizzled, smoky fire manager who's been chasing fires for 25 years, 30 years, has never seen anything like this. And not only have they not seen anything like it, it is well outside the parameters of what they've seen before. So their mental model of how fire behaviour is going to look to them isn't there. And this is one of those things where I struggle a little bit with AI trying to predict fire spread. Fire behaviour is very much a non-linear thing. You can get to threshold conditions where suddenly you get, the atmosphere involved and things blow up, stuff that you've never really seen. And the training data set for that is really small because there's not that many of those. They're rare events. And so trying to be able to pick that reliably into the future is a problem. Fire behaviour analyst's job is to help you, the incident controller, use science to figure that bit out. Because when you don't have a mental model to help you predict, really science is the best tool that we've got left to help you with that. So that's
when all else fails, resort to science, huh?
Well, what else? If there's something better than science, I'm all for it.
Right. But it should be our first tool.
Yeah. Right. So that's going back to your question on the decision support stuff. They're one and the same thing. So fire behaviour analysts, they don't just predict fires. They also help plan and advise on suppression options and incident management options. So on any given day, we could be, helping them understand community warnings, timings. We could be helping them understand evacuation routes and timings. So what should we do given the fire could do this in the next sort of 4 to 6 hours? So that's operational decision support. And then there's the sort of the risk-based decision support, which is when you don't actually have a fire going in the landscape, and you're more looking at, what could happen next fire season at the peak levels of weather. And given that we know what that risk looks like across the landscape, what should we be doing between now and then to mitigate it? So where do we put asset protection zones? Where do we put our strategic fire advantage zones? And what preparatory activities really should we be doing and where in order to minimise that as best we can?
Let me ask you about Garry Kasparov,
chess player.
The chess player, yes,
yep.
Right, who in some ways epitomized the old fire chief. I've been doing this forever, and there's nothing you can tell me about it. And no, pit me up against any machine, and I'll whip its butt. Well, that's not how it turned out for him.
No, it's not.
Right. Deep Blue showed him that being able to think 20,000 moves ahead was different than being able to think 20 moves ahead.
Yep.
In terms of the outcome. So when I think about bushfire decision support, or what we call wildfire, I think about it in terms of the capability of AI or machine learning systems to play chess against a fire in real time, where instead of knights and rooks and queens and bishops, you have helicopters, large aerial tankers, troops with, axes, whatever your assets are, right? So each asset has a capability.
Sure.
And then depending on what your fire behavior analysis says is going to happen, what your values at risk are, you could then tell the system, well, okay, here's how I need to prioritize these risks, right? Protect the nuclear plant first, then the hospital, then the orphanage, right? And then here's what we have to work with. And could a system not give you an optimized suppression plan based on what you got to work with better than somebody who says, well, just there's the fire, drop the airplane there? It's like, well, maybe that's where the 2 helicopters can go and the save the plane for this. Or like, how do you game out the different options that you have for a suppression response?
Yeah, that's a big question. So the first thing I'd say is that fighting fires isn't chess. Yes, there's moves. Yes, there's suppression plans. Chess is it's a bounded game. It's got rules. It's deterministic. So you don't know necessarily what the opponent's going to do, but you can only move a rook in a certain way, right?
Right.
And in the game itself, the board doesn't move. The wildfire circumstance, I think, is much different. There are no rules. We make them up as we go. And there's so many, like in chess, you always know how the rook's going to perform. Okay, you know what it does to perfection. It's only going to do one type of thing. With firefighters, you get different standards. You get professional firefighters who are amazingly capable people and can work extremely quickly, solve problems on the fly. Amazing. You get volunteers who can do that too, but potentially not as well. You get different levels of training among those assets. You then throw in variable weather. So, you know, forecasting is not a perfection or a perfected science. We don't know beyond a few hours ahead what the weather's actually going to do. Sometimes we know better than other times. So things go wrong on the fire ground. So, you know, your rook can, you know, bust a tire or get bogged in a bad place, or, you know, so I think there's a lot of scope for AI to make suggested moves, but I don't believe that there is a true optimal solution for any suppression plan, because you don't know the future with certainty. So
No, but I think
you can't assess an optimal. But the
not
idea,
one time anyway. But
yeah,
could you continuously, as conditions change on the ground and your assets come and go, at any given time, there's a best thing to be doing?
yes, and I think that there's absolutely room for tech to help there. Because one of the problems with incident management and suppression planning as a planning officer and being under pressure, things are always changing, and you're always trying to get to the next shift plan. And what does our next shift plan look like? What's our strategy? What's our play? So there'll be an optimal a level of assistance that you can deliver for that. I think you're absolutely right. So there's room for that. I don't think we should rely on it, and I don't think it should ever be a replacement for that. But there's also a potential for it to be a bit dangerous. So there's a potential to become just a bit lazy and wait for the box to tell us what to do when you miss the big elephant in the room. And I'd be worried about that, because you're relying on the box to see everything, and you know, it may not. So there's also the danger, I think, mid-shift of the box telling you something, and then you're going to completely change the plan that you were working on in response to it, when you may not have the time and space available to deliver all the materials to execute the plan properly in the next shift. So there's all sorts of issues, I think, around this, but I'm not saying for a second that it's not worth pursuing and worth trying. But I think we've got to be really careful about, you know, the moths to the bright flame of technology in all of this. There's a tendency to chase technical solutions when, you know, like I said at the beginning, given the cultural, legal, and political issues, I don't know that the bigger problems that we need to solve are actually going to be solved with technology. You know, and I think if we can go towards alleviating a lot of those political, cultural, and legal problems, the skill sets that we have and the resources that we've become really good at fighting fires. Can we be better? Always, you know, and it is always organised chaos. But if we can alleviate, based on the fire management problem, you know, get a better educated public, get more applied fire in the landscape, start reducing and managing the fuel complex better, then the need for, you know, the super high-end elite tech sort of gets drawn back a bit, and, you know, it's gonna help us, I think.
What about, you know, applying technology in limited circumstances where we're willing to risk robots, not people?
Sure. Yeah. I'm all for, like, any time that we can, you know, avoid risk to a human being. Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's definitely a case for that. So, you know, I'm a huge fan of technology applied to the fire space. But what I would like to see is, instead of the mad dash for, you know, high-end response technologies, I'd like to see some of that diverted to what you referred to before. How do we make prescribed fire safer? What about precision lighting using drones in a prescribed fire sense? What about, spot fire suppression from the air to protect prescribed fire escapes? Using AI to better characterize changing weather conditions to support planned burn execution. There's a huge amount of room for the tech sector to not just unlock good fire and prescribed fire at scale, but to really make it safe and transform the way we do that. But right now, what I see is that there's very little of that going on. There's a few bits of tech emerging in the prescribed fire space, like BurnBot and a few other things, and it's wonderful to see it. But really, I think the lion's share of the tech investment is chasing response, just like everyone else. And I don't think that's how we're going to solve the problem.
I mean, and for kind of obvious reasons, because when you define the problem, okay, the problem is that there's a huge wall of fire coming towards our town. Got it. It's very easy to define, right? And and then as investors who back tech, they would say, well, okay, we want to go into the fire space. Where's the most money being spent that we could get a share of?
That's right.
Suppression.
Exactly.
Right, when you have those two conditions, it wouldn't be surprising that there's very little going into the pre-mediation.
Exactly right. This is a self-reinforcing thing, and I don't know what's required to break that cycle, but I do know that it's probably needed more than we think, because this is not a problem we can solve through response. Response will always be necessary, but we're working on the wrong end of it, I think, and it's not. And I'm sorry if that's discouraging for tech people.
No, it's not.
Because like I said, I think there's actually more room for tech in the fire management, fuel management space than there is in response. I think they'd be happier there, but we just don't seem to be there yet.
There's certainly less chance for failure. Because if you go to fight a fire and the fire comes through anyway, well, you lost. If you do pre-mitigation work, maybe you can take credit for the fire that didn't happen.
That's right.
Right, but there's no losing in that, or a fire that would have been a terrible fire becomes a manageable fire.
Yep, that's it. And it's measurable, right? Like, the more work we put into, and this is happening in various parts of the world. So there's a really great story in the north end of Australia. So over about the last 15 years, our state and federal governments and others have been putting money into the Indigenous ranger programs. Wow. We're getting Indigenous people with cultural connections to country and fire back onto country in a paid sense to actually start doing applied fire the way they used to. And we've seen tremendous results, like incredible results, improvements in biodiversity, a significant reduction in wildfire, as in late season hot fires that are damaging to the landscape. And so, this is the somewhat frustrating thing, is that we know that this can work. But, it's a different thing to go from, outback Australia to the wildfire urban interface, next to Los Angeles, for example, where, that's a much more complex and challenging problem, not because we don't know that good applied fire in those landscapes will benefit, but because of the human acceptance of the fact that could happen, and that occasionally those burns are going to cause a problem. Do we want to have an environment in a society where occasionally we accept that there's a problem, or do we want to just do nothing and wait for the catastrophe? That's the choice. And I don't know that the public fully understand the choice yet, but that's the choice. And hopefully we can do both. We can get these people back onto country, and we can start to, manage the wildfire urban interface with the public education set a little bit better. And maybe start to see some gains.
Another area that you bring up, though, that may be lacking is that in Indigenous burning is very specific to the topography and the vegetation of that area, which would lead me to assume that you couldn't take Aboriginal Bushmen who are very effective at cultural burning in their area. You couldn't bring them to Los Angeles and expect them to, whip out a plan in vegetation they've never seen and climates they have not experienced?
Oh, I don't know that it's as bad as that. So
Okay.
we tend to have this sort of mental model of Indigenous people having figured out the rules of applied fire, and then started burning. It actually was the other way around. So if you sort of do the thought experiment, Steve Pine he talks us through this in one of his books. It really stuck with me. If you do the thought experiment of, okay, let's take away everything that's fossil fuel powered. All right, so we don't have chainsaws, we don't have fire appliances, no pumps, no aircraft. We've got nothing that we can, use that's fossil fuel powered. How do you make that environment safe in the WUI? What do? Right? There's really only one thing left, right? You either burn it or you don't.
Cut the trees straight.
And so the Indigenous people didn't so much figure out the rules and then start burning. They just started burning to save themselves and hunt better. And the rules kind of evolved around them. So the landscape adapted to them burning. It wasn't the other way around. And so the specificity that you need really emerges from what are fundamentally fairly simple rules. Burn early in the dry season. Burn light wherever you can, so don't have intense fire. And then burn often. So every few years, you light it up again. And the final one I would argue is you burn semi-randomly. So you don't always do the same thing in every single place. You let the randomness in the landscape sort it out. And just following very basic rules like that at landscape scales, you will start to see things adapt. Life will figure that out. You don't need the, PhD on this particular species of vegetation to make that work. We never had that before, and so you don't need that level of specificity.
Okay.
There's some of it, and you've got to go in understanding that you're in chaparral versus pine forest or whatever it happens to be.
Right.
But you don't need a PhD in fire ecology in every single landscape that you're in. I don't think. I think there's ways to unlock this at landscape scales with much simpler approaches, seasonal approaches, return interval approaches that are guidelines that you can conform to without having to go back to school.
Yeah. Right. I mean, there is a sense that there is some shamanistic knowledge there. If I know, like, okay, people in the Amazon, when they have an infection, they rub this plant on it. And if my lesson from that is like, oh, rub plants on your things, and then I go out and I start rubbing poison ivy on myself, not knowing what I'm doing,
Yeah.
making a problem. So I think there has to be a healthy respect for the lessons that have been learned, even if they were learned in a randomized way.
Oh, look, absolutely. So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying for a second that, Indigenous knowledge isn't deep, specific, and really important. It absolutely is. Of course it is. The challenge for me is, how do we scale that up?
Yeah.
So how do we scale that up in a way that is not overwhelming and doesn't require me to go and live in the outback with Indigenous rangers for 25 years and be raised on this stuff? Because that's not going to happen.
Right.
And so it's about trying to find the balance, I think, between how do we unlock enough of this amazing Indigenous culture and knowledge into, the modern sort of fire management world, in a way that respectfully treats that knowledge and applies it and is able for people like me to apply it, right? Like I'm not an Indigenous person, but like I said, I've trained with them a tiny bit and I have a huge amount of respect for them. And how do we find that balance is the key. And how do we do that in an inclusive and respectful way?
And quickly.
One of the things we want to do here in my local brigade area is I'm really keen to get Indigenous people involved. So the local Jinnaburra people, I'm very keen whenever we do prescribed fire on private land, is unlocking that. So let's be inclusive, and let's sort of learn from each other about how we do this in a modern sense.
You brought up doing this on private land.
Yeah.
And I think that the opportunities to test new technologies, methodologies, etc., in a privately owned property are very different than they are in public spaces.
Yep.
Right. There's a lot more restrictions on what you can do in public areas.
That's true. and a lot more bureaucracy. So
Right.
trying to get the permissions needed from the various public agencies to apply fire is a challenge. It goes back to that cultural, legal, societal and political problems, right? Private land in some sense is much easier. And I really like, as a volunteer firefighter, burning on private property because it lets us connect directly with the landholders and educate people,
Yeah.
and start to sort of bust some of the myths around, that fire is really important to this country's health and your property's health, and watch the results. And just trust us, we'll help you do it. But yeah, by all means, monitor how the country responds, and we'll be back in 3 or 4 years and we'll do it again, and we can tell us how it goes on the way. And we've had some amazing results up here, restoring certain country back to health. It's been really good. So we're trying to, like I said, scale is the thing for me. How do we take those fairly simple rules and approaches, and how do we teach every volunteer firefighter this stuff, and how do we get all of the private landholders, that happy and engaged with good fire on their lands? And I think, everyone to me has a part to play in this. There's the public education piece, which, I'm trying to do directly through volunteer firefighting. There's other big facets of that I'm not going to control. But for our part, I like to think that every time we put fire on someone's land, we have a good, meaningful conversation about the importance of it, the respect that we're showing the country, and how good that's going to be for them, and then how we communicate that to other firefighters in other parts of the state, so that we can start to get good fire at scale. Scale's the thing.
So scale ultimately comes down to some form of methodology, and the depth of education needn't be great. And the analogy might be to performing CPR. You don't have to be a cardiologist. You
Nope.
don't have to know much about how the heart works,
That's right.
right? And you can teach anyone to do it in 30 minutes.
Yep.
Well enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So how do you create basically the CPR program for good fire or
Yeah, it's a great
beneficial
question.
fire?
So, and I've got sort of two parts to the answer. So, being with my volunteer hat on, there's how do we do that inside the agency? So, how do we alter the training program for new firefighters and existing firefighters, and sort of shift the thinking towards, and to their great credit, Queensland Fire is doing some really good things in that space. The Jigger Jar program was just one of them that I mentioned, that I was part of that. That was QFES that set that up. And they are doing, really useful things in terms of teaching mitigation better and how to do applied fire better. We've got a ways to go. The other piece of this is, and it's one of the things that caused me to leave the fire agency, is I was constantly being asked by local governments and, forestry and utility companies about accessing the tech, the knowledge, the data to do exactly what you're talking about. How do we unlock those tools and capabilities to let us, as these organisations, manage fire better in our areas? Because I'm not entirely sure how it works in the US. I know the Forest Service owns a lot of land over there, but in Australia, most of the land is privately held, and the stuff that's not is national parks, and they'll have their problem. And if it's not national parks, it'll be, a local government who own conservation areas in there, and that'll be their problem. So we have this sort of fragmented set of organisations and agencies in a hierarchy, and that works fabulous for budgets and for telling people what to do. Where it doesn't work so great is answering the questions like you're asking, which is, how do I create a system that can centralise the science, centralise the data, centralise the tech and the methods, but make it accessible across all of those organisations? So we're now starting to share a common understanding of the risk, and we're now starting to be able to collaborate more easily and seamlessly between us. that you can't solve from inside any one of those entities because they're not budgeted for it, and
Right.
it's not their remit. So you can't go to a local government and go, hey, why don't you invest your own budget in solving this problem for everybody? They're going to go, well, that's not in our budget. We're not going to do that. So to me, this can only be solved higher up in the hierarchy. So it's sort of federal level in the US and here in Australia, which it isn't, or at least not very well. Or you can do it from industry, and you can know what needs to be done. You can find people with the vision and the will to invest and do it, and then turn it into something that is everybody wins. And that's kind of my goal, is to find the way that we can sort of centralize the science, the data, the tech, the processes into something that is good enough for everybody to access and have a common understanding of the risk, common understanding of the shared future, and enables them to more seamlessly and easily collaborate between themselves, rather than waiting for a fire agency to say, twice a year we're going to have a meeting, we're going to talk about our plans. There might be a better way to do it than that, which is, we've got a great example in social media. People are talking to each other all the time. They're sharing imagery and media and pictures and layers and things all the time. This is not an intractable problem. We can come up with something now that is going to help do that. And for me, that's the other big part of the question. So inside the fire agency, we'll do it, but outside the fire agency, that's my day job, and that's what I want to try to focus on.
I think that's fascinating that you brought up social media, which would include, anything from fun social media to LinkedIn, Facebook for business, right? And the conversations that take place on those platforms, I think, is really starting to do what you suggested, of dividing the problem out into small enough pieces that individuals can make progress and then collectively benefit from the contributions of everyone.
Yeah, that's it. And we've got to centralize stuff too. Like, in terms of the fire science community and fire behavior analysis people, there's just not enough of us that every local government can have their own. It's just not realistic. And so the question for me becomes well, then how do you intelligently centralize that so that, you can unlock the wisdom and the knowledge in that space for everyone to access, equally. And we're not there yet. We keep referring back to fire agencies and other agencies that have these, they breed and grow these groups. But they're not accessible, widely beyond that. And I think we have to change that.
When you say to decentralize, to decentralize the application, but to centralize the knowledge, would that be the same thing as what we call de-siloing the knowledge that every university, right? And you've got great universities down there, like where Rino Ruggieri is working on evacuation modeling, and UC San Diego is doing supercomputer fire prediction, but there's not really a process by which the information gets readily shared. And even if there is, they're written in different computer codes and different languages.
So operationalizing that is my passion, right? So how do we want to, when I say centralize, what I mean is that we want to have the people who like me, they're a bit geeky. They like reading journals. They like understanding the latest that's being published and put out in conferences. How do we make that job easier for local governments who don't have anybody who does that really? Like some of the more, sort of geeky fire managers might do that. But then they've got all their work ahead of them after that. So, okay, great. Right. We've gone and read about, this particular piece of fire science, which is really cool, and it's going to change the way we do things. But the changing the way we do things is the hard part. So how do you then go from something in a paper to, okay, now we've changed the maths in a particular approach for calculating fire behavior for this particular circumstance, to here's what it looks like in a data layer. Here's who it ends up with to make decisions about it when we're planning a planned burn or we're dealing with a wildfire. And then based on that, what do they do? That whole operationalization piece is hard. And that's where I think centralization can really help, because the agencies do that. They'll figure out how to leverage the latest stuff and get it out into standard operating procedures and deploy it through their training systems, and that's fabulous for them. But nobody else gets it. And so how do we kind of maximize the efficiency of that process and make it ubiquitously available? That I think is something that we're not doing, because I truly believe that how we move knowledge and emerging knowledge through these organizations into people who are actually going to make a different choice, right? That's how we change the world. We move them from going, well, I would have done that before, but now based on this new approach, I'm going to do this, and it's a better outcome. That's how we change the world. And it seems to me that that engine that we use to do that is a bit broken, and it's not very well set up. And so I'm figuring out how to rebuild the engine.
Fascinating work. Well, I look forward to touching base with you more often and finding out how that work is going, what's working and what's not working.
Yeah.
Two things happen to me, Ben, when I do this podcast. One, I learn a lot, and simultaneously I unlearn a lot and find out how little I knew in the first place. So, and you've done both of those things for me.
Okay, in a good way, I have.
I appreciate it. Yeah, no, I mean, what is it? Mark Twain said, it ain't the things you know that get you in trouble. It's right, or that are so. It's the things that you know that aren't so.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's a lot of things that we know that are wrong, and just are products of the culture, and not the science.
Yeah, and I think, like Steve Pine says in one of his books, what we know or don't know or think we know wrongly, it's as important as the moisture content in fuels, right? Like if we're working off wrong knowledge or wrong assumptions, we can do a tremendous amount of damage. And I think there's a lot of scope for us to help fix that.
Great note to end, Ben. Thank you so much. What a fascinating series of works that you're doing simultaneously. And I want to thanks so much for joining me on the Fire Break today.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure, mate. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I'd love to talk to you again.
Me too. We'll schedule again next month.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's soon.
Well,
sure.
I mean, at the pace of change of the world, a month is a long time.
It can be
in the fire space.
Absolutely.
And I'm so tired of hearing the word unprecedented in front of every fire. I'm just going to take it for granted. Okay, they're all unprecedented now. We're all off in new waters. We can stop saying that, and nobody knows what's going on anymore. So
yeah, that's it. The other one I figure it out altogether. This is the new normal. This is not the new normal. We're accelerating on this gradient. It's going to get a lot worse than it is now.
Right.
And so we aren't stabilizing in a new normal. We're on the ride up, and we're running out of time to figure this stuff out.
Yeah, absolutely. Exciting times, right?
Yeah,
the old Chinese curse. May you live in exciting times.
Yeah.
But I guess we brought it on ourselves, and now we got to work ourselves out. But we're humans, and one of the things that humans do well, besides make a lot of mistakes, is have ingenuity to work themselves out most of the time.
Yep.
And for the last couple 100,000 years, it's worked so far. So we're going to hope that continues.
Yes.
Ben Twomey, thanks so much for joining me. You've been listening to The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. Ben Twomey right there in Brisbane. Reach out to him on LinkedIn and find out what he's up to, or just tune in here monthly, because we'll be touching base and seeing how things are going.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for joining us on The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We'll see you at the next one. Take care.
Thanks, Steve.